Good evening, everyone. Very good to see you here. Welcome to a panel on the small matter of the state and fate of the world order, and possibly the future of the world order. I'm Alec Russell, the foreign editor of the Financial Times. In many ways, this session is a sort of natural follow-on to the sessions on the Middle East and Ukraine, because, of course, the wrenching wars there, the tensions between America and China, and other matters have all fueled the impression that the post-Cold War order is, at the very least, on the wane. And then, of course, coming up in the headlights is the possibility of a second term for Donald Trump and the implications of an ultra-interventionist, if not isolationist, presidency. Ultra-unilateralist is what I meant to say. We've got a terrific panel here. I'm not going to race through their CVs because you know them all. They've all written many books on the world order, consulted governments, and thought long and hard about it. On my right here is Francois Heisbourg, Senior Advisor for Europe and the International Institute for Strategic Studies, for which he's been, in which he's been involved many, many years. Dr. Henry Wang, the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization, who's popped over from Beijing. Anna Wieslander, the director of the Northern Europe office of the Atlantic Council. On her right there is Nick Nanos, the chief data scientist and founder of Nanos Recherche. And on the far right, we have William Drozdiak, the Global Europe Fellow of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, and the author of a recent book on, I was about to say Sarkozy, Macron, of course. Bill, I want to start with you. I want you to imagine that President Biden has summoned you to the Oval Office and said to you, Bill, tell it to me straight, how is the US-led global order doing these days?
Well, the sad news is it's in dire straits, but I think what is going to drive Biden's policies over the next 6 months are the electoral considerations. As many of you know, our bizarre election system depends on the electoral college winning the majority of votes there, which means a handful, maybe up to a half dozen states will decide the outcome of this election. So as a result, the policies of the Biden administration over the next 6 months are going to be driven intensively by political considerations. We already see that right this week, probably by the end of the week, he is going to issue an executive order that will stop immigration across the southern border, because polls show that this is a big concern for a lot of Americans. Secondly, Biden has always been somewhat of the part of the protectionist wing of the Democratic Party, much more so than his Democratic predecessors, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, who were espousing liberal trade agreements. So what you will see is a growing effort by the Biden administration to stop exports in order to appeal to American workers. Janet Yellen was just this past week in Beijing, gave a very tough presentation and speech saying we are not going to allow China to do to our economy what they were allowed to do in the past 10 or 20 years. The meeting with the Japanese Prime Minister this week was, the tone was good, but they did not come anywhere near resolving this touchy issue about Japan, I think Nissan, buying up, the Japanese steel giant buying up US steel. And Biden has said, no, this is a national security consideration. So I think you will see a much more protectionist set of policies, which is not good news for the European Union over the next few months. And then, but even so, a lot of Democratic pollsters I've spoken to over the past few weeks whom I know quite well, are extremely worried that he's going to lose the Arab American vote, 100,000 who voted for him 4 years ago. He's going to lose the Latino vote. And he's also going to alienate a lot of college students.
We'll turn to the election in a sec, possibly. I'm keen to return to Trump, and I'm keen to. Do you mind if we flip from domestic politics to the world? And I outrageously spin to Beijing now. Henry, yes. Bill has presented a picture of an America that is increasingly inward-looking, focused on domestic politics, and possibly not thinking about the world as it was in the 90s and beyond. How does it seem to you sitting in Beijing?
Okay, great, thank you. I think it's really great to talk about this subject and thank the organizer for organizing this. I think we are now in a world of really great deep trouble, you know, because we had, you know, just finished the world virus war, basically, right? COVID has took many things on hold. And then we had almost on the brink of a second Cold War. So you remember 78 years ago when we finished the Second World War, I mean, the Bretton Woods system is really established. But now that system is really, I think, needs greatly to be improved. So it's really, we should have some new Bretton Woods moment. I think if I sit in Beijing, I'm looking at this, the war is getting into big trouble. I mean, we had war fighting in the Europe continent, we have war fighting in the Middle East, and we have trade war, tech war. You know, all those things happening, and where our common enemy, I mean, the climate threats, you know, we don't really pay attention to, and, you know, there's also other pandemic that may be coming again, and also AI, which is another threat. So I think the world needs really a reflection moment. We have to really work together. But I think the fundamental problem that we don't have the trust now, particularly among the big powers. And then the UN is really, you know, WTO, and we see many organizations paralyzed somewhere. And yet for something happens so obvious in the Middle East, in the Gaza, the whole world is watching that in the living room, but cannot do much. So I think it's really important to revitalize the leadership. So that's why I think that, you know, US, EU, China, I mean, being the three largest economy in the world, should really work together. And really not really the building up all kind of overemphasized security, like we have US busy with NATO, of course, with Five Eyes, with AUKUS, with Quad, with Camp David, you know, all those security apparatus beefed up. And now talking about getting Japan to AUKUS. So that's too much. But I think China pursued a very unique role, which basically promote economic globalization. We had AIB, we had the Belt and Road, we joined the RCEP, we were working on the CPTPP, and also a number of bilateral, multilateral platform talking about China-Africa Economic Summit, Latin American, you know, Central Asia, everywhere, and ASEAN. So that's really, I think, the way to go. We still have to really get into the fundamentals of economic globalization and really build the prosperity so that we can prevent a real third war happening. But if we're not doing like this, I mean, high fence, small yard, we may get into really deep trouble.
So as it happens, I completely agree with you on the need for massive reform of the Bretton Woods institutions, but the underlying point you're making is one of trust, which seems it's going to be very, very hard to restore. Anna, can you come in here? So we have an inward-looking America. We have a China that is feeling somewhat boxed in by American alliances and even a bit put upon. There are other ways of looking at China too, of course. You think a lot about Europe's role in the global architecture. Is this Europe's moment?
Well, thank you, Alec, and it's wonderful to be back here at the Delphi Economic Forum. Actually, I want to start with Kissinger and world order, because when you talk about world order, we tend to think that this is something that has always existed. But he points out that, you know, from basically this is the first time that we have had an incipient world order from 1948 and onwards. And I think we all should ask ourselves, is this something that will continue, or was it a parenthesis in history at this point? If we look at the Biden administration, the US has led the order that we have had. If we look at their vision in the national security strategy, it's pretty clear that what they see is a world that transforms from unipolarity to bipolarity, with the US as the largest pole, China as the smaller pole, but the US cannot do it alone. So they need Europe, they need a few major Asian allies to kind of get this vision become a reality. And here we have the problem coming back to Europe, because Europe's major powers do not share that vision. You can already hear in the major speeches from Macron, from Schulz, they are already labeling the world as multipolar, as does China actually and Russia. So you have a big discrepancy here in what the vision is, and US doesn't really have the team behind them in creating the order they see. So what I would like to introduce here is a concept. It was introduced by a Danish professor. She's talking about a multi-order world as a possible alternative, where you would have the international liberal order still, but among ourselves, the communities that have kind of carried that and still feel of it. Basically, I would say enshrined in institutions such as NATO and the EU. Then, and a few others perhaps, but then you have a global rules-based order, which is the broader order, where you have interest-based exchanges. And if you talk about Europe in this, I think the major thing that Europe has to handle in this is that Russia will not be part of the things that will remain within the international liberal order, within NATO or EU, so to say. We have to give up on the vision of an all-inclusive European security architecture from Vladivostok to Vancouver. And that might sound easy because we have defined Russia as the most acute threat, direct threat to Euro-Atlantic security. But still, there are remnants from the past in thinking about this that would tend to say that we cannot have an order in Europe without Russia. So I think that's where the dilemma lies now, and it's quite dispersed and we are not on track, but it's important to discuss it.
Thank you. I think tremendously important to have started with that Kissinger point, because there clearly wasn't ever a golden age for a world order. I mean, it's tempting. Lots of people like to look back to the 90s as being this sort of amazing era, and yet, of course, 1994 was the year of the Rwandan genocide, which I actually covered some of, and there was a world order then. But as Francois, as you were saying, sometimes you can have a world order and it's looking away or it's disorderly. Can we bring you in here, Francois? Much of your career has been spent looking at the era of US-led hegemony. How imperiled is it now?
Now, to answer your basic question, I'd answer with 6 words: bad, not yet bad, and really bad. The bad is the non-security related world order. Henry said that COVID had put a lot of things on hold. You're absolutely right. It also put the global order on hold. If mankind is not able to use its institutions to face a world-threatening disease like the one which broke out in Wuhan, then there probably isn't very much hope for the global order. And that's what happened. It wasn't simply Donald Trump pulling the US out of the World Health Organization. He pulled it out for a couple of reasons, which were widely shared by many other people in the world. That's when you actually saw the beginning of the breakdown of the global order. And just to bounce back on what you're saying about disorder, disorder has always been around, but so much of today's disorder is actually global. It's not simply local. You know, you take something like Sudan, you take something like Somalia, you take crises like that, and you see every Tom, Dick, and Harry is invested in that particular disorder. It's not simply the local actors. So that was the bad. And I say bad because if you can't deal with the pandemic using our institutions, then what are the chances that we'll be able to do so in a constructive way with global warming, just a minor challenge, or indeed with artificial intelligence, another minor challenge? Now, the not yet so bad is the security side, paradoxically. For the moment, the alliance system is holding. And if there has been an element of order on the planet since the end of the 1940s, it has been in the realm of security, to the extent that you had alliance systems, sometimes competing in the Cold War era, or in the unipolar era when the US had its moment. That, of course, is over, but for the moment, the alliance system is holding. Japan has not yet started to want to produce its own nukes. South Korea has not yet done so after having renounced them in the 70s. But that is where things can get really bad. If the alliance system itself, the US-centric alliance system, breaks down, then you are really going to have an enormous amount of disorder. So if you think that it's bad for the time being, you must assume that it could get a lot worse. I'm very sorry to dampen the spirits here.
Thank you for that optimistic view, Francois.
That's my job.
Nick, I want to bring you in here. We've been focusing heavily on geopolitics and security. But there are a number of other very key undercurrents to what's going on in the world now. In particular, the energy transition, and indeed the sort of whole new world order of natural resources. I know you've been thinking a lot about the fallout of the shale revolution in the US, and I wonder if you could shed light on how you think that is changing what we've all been talking about.
No, thanks, Alec. From my perspective as a social scientist and academic, I'm going to have a little bit of a different perspective on a lot of these things. And there are two key things from my perspective, structural, foundational things that help inform what's happening and where things are going from my perspective. And let's talk about the shale revolution. So the shale revolution truly was a revolution for the United States. The United States went from being dependent on oil from Canada and the Middle East to being energy self-sufficient. And that energy imperative, from my perspective, fundamentally changes how Americans see the world and all their allies. So when they see the Middle East, when they are not requiring Middle East oil or dependence as they did in the past, their views on the state of Israel are much more fluid and flexible. Their views on a number of Middle Eastern regimes can be a lot more flexible. And it changes as opposed to what I'll say the old paradigm where there was an economic imperative where the United States had a direct economic stake in keeping security and stability in particular regions. And I think that's playing itself out in terms of how the Biden administration is looking at things. And when we also think about the energy market writ large, we have to think of the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and how that is rewiring things, because we have projects like the India, Middle East, Europe corridor that is strategically important to Greece that is changing that energy marketplace. So I look at those things, and when I look at those economic imperatives, I see how they explain how policy is changing, especially among the hegemonic powers. The second thing, and I'll be super quick, has to do with political license. Here's something. I don't think it makes any difference who's in the Oval Office, and I don't think it makes any difference who is leading Russia in terms of the policy in the world. Because the reality is that there's an increasing proportion in the United States, for example, of global skeptics. Both Biden and Trump are chasing after blue-collar workers who believe that global trade and free trade doesn't work for them because they're struggling to pay for the bills. So they're chasing after the same voters. And I think we're going to go through a cycle of isolationism in the United States where both parties are going to be chasing after those voters because they're the ones that are up for grabs. So there's no political license, I think, or little or less political license in the United States for the US to be active around the world. And even if we look at another country like Russia, there's no political license for Russia to be defeated by Ukraine. That has to be recognized. The reality is, when you look at Russian history, it's hard to see a situation where they will ever accept. So when we're trying to understand where I think things are going in the world, we have to think about how our energy policy is changing, food security, water security, how our economic imperatives are changing, and also what type of political license do leaders have? Because, and this will be my last point, those political leaders are riding forces, they're not shaping forces, and they're trying to control them. And I think that particular lens, from my perspective, brings a little more order to the disorder, why don't we say.
Bill, it's the moment for the T words. You're allowed to go Trump now, okay? So well, Nick had just suggested, somewhat provocatively, possibly, that it may be that it doesn't matter who's in the Oval Office. I was in Washington a few weeks ago talking to some people who are purportedly close to Trump, and I got the impression that some policies would change dramatically. I wonder, there you are, you're in Washington. How isolationist would a Trump second term be, and what impact would that have on the global order?
Well, if he does come back into the White House.
But let's just, given that we don't know, let's just imagine that he comes back.
Yeah, no, I want to make larger points, but I'll say just on Trump, he will find, I think, his hands tied by Republican senators. I mean, Francois mentioned the alliance network. This is the strongest advantage America has in its rivalry with the autocratic powers, Russia and China. We have a strong network in Asia. We have a strong network in Europe. And pro-Trump senators like Marco Rubio and Lindsey Graham have said, we will not allow him to pull out of NATO unless there is a majority in the Senate. So that's not going to happen. But the larger point is a lot of the forces unleashed in the world today have escaped control of our institutions and also of leaders. Just take demographics and climate change. Henry, in China, with the shrinking of the population, and also in Japan, as well as Europe, this is having profound economic implications for the future. In Israel, the huge growth in the ultra-Orthodox community is driving Israel's policy on settlements toward the right. And I think that the panel that we had on the Middle East didn't get a chance to discuss this, but one of the fears that I have for the future is that right-wing Israeli government will decide what to do what Ariel Sharon always wanted to do, which was a Palestinian state already exists. It happens to be called Jordan. Let's deport all the Palestinians of the West Bank across the Jordan River, and that will resolve this issue once and for all. Africa. 1 in 3 human beings later this century will be African. The pressures of the population combined with climate change. Today, Lake Chad is drying up. 50 million people get their daily sustenance from Lake Chad. By 2035, that will be completely evaporated, and those people have to move and move right away. And they're not going to want to go next door to Niger, Burkina Faso. They all have cell phones. They want to move to Europe. So I think populations on the move are going to be an enormous challenge, and we don't have the global order, global institutions to deal with all of this. And as we've seen, even on climate change, you can get an agreement in Paris, but it just doesn't get implemented. And even one that does make a lot of sense, like the law of the seas, gets rejected by the stupidity in the American Congress. Right now, China has control over deep seabed mining in 5 key spots. The Americans have nothing because we've refused to go along with the law of the seas convention. And as a result, that's where we're putting ourselves at a big disadvantage.
Yeah. Yeah, Henry, I want to come to you in a sec, but I want to turn to Anna first. Anna, on the subject of alliances and Trump, a lot has been written and said about the implications for NATO of a second Trump term. Could it be argued, though, that actually what Trump has been saying recently has been quite good for NATO and for Europe, for the European powers in NATO, as in forcing them to come to terms with their own defense spending and their own systems of procurement and so on?
Well, I think that if you talk to most Europeans now, everyone would say more or less that Trump had a point. It wasn't his point from the start. Other presidents had said that before, but he pushed it so far in combination that, and actually NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg used it. He thought he was right as well, and he could use it to push further. And then Russia helped us out, of course, with their actions. So now a majority of countries will meet the 2% target at the Washington summit this summer. But you know, how Trump plays into a future world order, I would like to divide that in two dimensions. If you look at, I mean, it will still be America, right, whether it's Trump or Biden. And as such, America is so powerful that whatever actions Trump will take, balancing measures, that will affect the global system, that will become balance of power in the system. So I think on defense spending, I would assume he will keep that high. He did that in his previous period, and he used it a lot as a means of being a strong man. So I think defense spending, that is internal balancing, will prevail. The most interesting part is then the alliances, the external balances. What will he do? And I don't think he doesn't need to leave NATO. He can just weaken NATO by proposing appeasement with Russia, for instance, and that will cause a huge blow to the unity in the alliance and cause fear and distrust across the Atlantic. So that is what we struggle with the most in this moment, the discussions in Europe, in Northern Europe, where I am situated. How can we possibly handle this? And the other reaction that I think will come pretty soon is what I hinted at previously, Europeans thinking that Europe could be a pole of itself in a future world system, and European independence, European sovereignty through the European Union, where we have already transcended sovereignty, could be a bigger actor of its own. But remember then, I think that we on the military side are still rather weak, not in capabilities or resources as such, but in the way we can operate them together and to have some kind of feature in this. We also, if you compare to China, who has in recent years built up its nuclear arsenal, Europe is lacking a nuclear deterrent by itself. So there is still a transatlantic dependency, you can call it, from that perspective, but there should be no illusions from a European side that if you want to be a player of yourself, you also have to invest in a rather big program, I would argue, for a solitary nuclear deterrence. So overall, this is very premature, and I think looking at the world, it would still make most sense for America, Europe, and Asian allies to keep together the international liberal order that we have and to build through our institutions resilience in this matter. So that would be my recipe, so to say, to meet such a scenario.
Henry, I've been traveling a bit recently in a number of the so-called middle powers, the sort of some of the big, what were once known as sort of developing economies, and I was quite struck by how sanguine some of the politicians there were We're talking about, well, the thing about sanguine about a Trump presidency,
Yes.
talking about, well, the thing about Trump is he's transactional, you sort of know what you get, less strategic vision than Biden, should be okay. And that there's been this assumption that that is the view in Beijing, that, that Beijing might prefer a Trump presidency because while you get a lot of rhetoric and there's some unpredictability, there's less follow through. What's your perspective on what a Trump presidency would mean for China and whether it is true that probably people in power would rather Trump than Biden?
Well, I think that really Trump disrupted the world since his first term. You know, in 2017, he put forward this strategic report, put China as strategic rivalry #1. I mean, that's how he started. But he's, on the other hand, I think his philosophy of MAGA, make America great again, that will continue to drive his second term. That's true. He's more deal-driven. I can see that he's going to end the war in Russia, in Ukraine. That's quite obvious. And I think, between China and the U.S., there's still a lot of, intertwined, and so it depends how he's look at it. If he wants to make a deal, if he wants to be deal-driven, China's still probably the best partner. He could continue phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and also I think that he's less ideologically driven. I mean, compared with Biden administration. So I don't know. I mean, this Biden strategy of putting up all those alliances could be weakened, if Trump comes back, and also that if he's really get more close to Russia, then annihilate all his European friends, and so I think it's hard to say what good or bad he brings back, but I would say he certainly stands for some uncertainty. But I think if he really wants to make America great again, where can you find the best partner to have China to be your partner to make America great again? Because China is now in manufacturing, investment. He actually said he wants BYD to build a plant in the U.S., which is okay. I mean, if he says that, I mean, let's get Chinese company to build a factory in the U.S. So we don't know. I mean, he could be I don't think he's going as revolutionary as far side as Nixon, but he could make some different changes. Certainly than those that we're seeing right now, which is keep building up all the alliances. But what the problem of Biden doing that is really it's divided bipolar world. You see the global South 80%, right? You see BRICS doubled last year, which BRICS GDP purchasing power is already bigger than the G7 now. So I think you need to really still have the world work together. We need a new, as I said, new Bretton Woods system, upgraded and enhanced. So China and the US still has to work together in order to really save the world, basically. Otherwise, it's going to be very dangerous. What we're going to have to see.
Yes.
Yes.
Well, there's more on the BRICS to come in the coming 2 days, so stay tuned. Francois, I saw you nodding rather dispiritedly during some of the previous interventions. How bad would it be for the world if, do you think, from your perspective, if Donald Trump were to get a second term?
Well, first, I'm actually with Henry on the analysis of who Trump is, about the level of uncertainty which is involved. There, of course, would be a difference, big difference between the second term and the first term, and that is in the first term, at least that's what he says, he was essentially checked and blocked by what he calls the deep state. And he's also made it very clear this was not going to happen again. So some of the wilder statements he made before or at the beginning of his first term may actually become real during his second term. I'd be very careful about that. Second point, in some ways, Trump is an accelerator rather than somebody who creates a different world. You take Ukraine. For the time being, Biden's policy on Ukraine is Trump's policy on Ukraine because that's the way American institutions function. no American weapons have been delivered to Ukraine since the beginning of the year. You don't have to wait for Trump to be elected to see that happen. And the fact that the American president did not find it electorally or politically or strategically possible to override the opposition of what appears to be a cabal of ultra-Trumpian, pro-Russian or anti-Ukrainian representatives in Congress says a lot about how far America actually has evolved independently of Trump. I take another topic, a much more important one in terms of the global order, and that is the erosion and probably the end of the 70-year-old consensus between Washington, D.C. and Moscow on nuclear non-proliferation. And if the number of nuclear states today is more or less what it was 40 years ago, it's because there was that consensus, both during the Cold War and after the Cold War. The agreement with Iran, for example, was an agreement of which Russia was a member, as well as China and the United States and the Europeans. You can see that frittering away, and not simply because Trump, during his first term, took the United States out of the nuclear agreement with Iran. Talk about disruption. By the way, that was a huge disruption. But the follow-on to that disruption is happening under Biden. So in history, it's not simply the matter itself which is important, it's the pace at which change happens. And here is where Trump is, I think, truly dangerous, in the sense that he may make things happen like an avalanche rather than as a smooth or relatively smooth evolution of things which were predestined to happen because of the rise of the middle powers, because of the arrival of China as a superpower, and the fact that Russia as a revisionist state has massively disrupted the European security order. That's where the Trump danger lies. Just a not so minor point. Israel was mentioned several times. If there is one topic on which there never has been a global order, and that has been on the ability of the world to actually do something about what is happening between the Palestinians and the Israelis since the War of Independence in 1948 between Israel and the Arab states. So I would not highlight that one as proof that the world order is disappearing. This is one area in which it's
remaining consistent.
Absolutely.
Consistently poor.
That's what I call global disorder.
Yes. Yeah. Nick, you presented earlier a slightly less bleak perspective on the possibility of a Trump presidency or the outcomes of a Trump presidency. You've just been listening to a fairly gloomy collective outlook. Well, Henry's slightly different, actually, to be fair. Have you changed your mind?
No. I think America's resilient. Period, full stop. Economically, and I'd like to believe, and I do believe that politically they're resilient too, even though they've been under stress. But you know, the broader problem that we have right now is that I would hazard to say that all of our political leaders have brought us to a near catastrophic failure in explaining the importance of global world order. What do I mean by that? Our political leaders are spending their time arranging the cutlery on the dining room table when they should be talking about the importance of stability and peace to prosperity. You know what, Alec? If people don't understand that peace in the Middle East is important globally to the economy, if they don't understand that we need to have peace in Europe in terms of Europe and Russia, we're not going to move forward in terms of the global project writ large, because we need to create prosperity. And to Bill's point, when he talked about Africa and growing population there, this is my last point, the best response to that is to have a world order that can create stability, peace, and prosperity, not just in the developed world, but in Africa, so that people don't necessarily have to leave. And you know what? people have left because of a lack of economic opportunity, and I think until the world order starts delivering on that, we're going to be in uncertain times.
So there's an inexorable clock staring at me there, which suggests we have just under 4 minutes to return to the theme, the title, about a revamp of the world order. What I'd love you all to do, very briefly, in less than a minute, is to answer the following question. I'll start with you, Bill. What would you do if you could do one thing to revamp the world order? What would that be?
Well, I suppose it would be striving to create a more effective and responsive institution or set of institutions. Right now, it's a very unsatisfactory situation. You look at the Permanent Security Council, the UN, there's talk about expanding it, but that would be a recipe for paralysis. You look at, somebody mentioned BRICS. BRICS is inherently contradictory. You've got Brazil, but also Russia, China, and India. Last time I looked, China and India were at, have a lot of problems to solve, and they're not going to do it there. I think it's looking for ad hoc solutions might be the best way to do it, or all-encompassing G20 type of solution, give more power to that institution. I think more so than the G7, which acts as an exclusive. But there's a desire and a hunger on the part of new powers, rising powers in the global south.
You're running out of you're over your half minute, Bill.
Yeah. The Indian foreign minister is one example of that. He just says, we're happy where we are. We have greater choice of, we don't have to be with the Americans, we don't have to be with the Chinese or the Russians. Yeah. We can be independent. And you're going to see more and more of that kind of thinking.
Okay,
in the third
so
world.
Anna, one idea, a better, more cohesive G20. What do you?
Well,
what's your suggestion?
My idea, since this is the Quest for Peace afternoon, and we have our Chinese friends here in the panel as well, I would really want to see an arms control regime on nuclear weapons, as we are entering a world where we'll have a triad of strategic weapons being able to use. And for non-nuclear powers, and for also those powers that have nuclear weapons but are not the size of the biggest ones, this would be a true sign of responsibility, and it would add transparency and, I think, hope for cooperation in an area of very big tensions. So that's highest on my wish list.
Very good. Nick?
Well, our leaders are hostage to voters. They're not going to do anything that is counter to what the domestic political situation is. And we need our political leaders to step up and say that everyone has an interest, from the blue collar to the white collar, in a stable, prosperous world order that creates opportunities, and that they should care. And I think once people start caring, there will be the political license to do that. But if they don't care, we're going to be stuck where we are right now.
Mm-hmm. Henry, how are you going to revamp the world order?
Yeah, no, about 2 weeks ago, I published a book with Graham Allison on, on how to escape Thucydides' trap. So because that is really.
Did you hear what he said? You all heard that, the Thucydides trap.
Because I think, Graham said, basically China-U.S. relations is like conjoined twins. We are really linked together. I mean, any bad move on one side would destroy the other. So I think it's important to get this China-U.S. relation on track, build up the trust. Otherwise, the world cannot solve anything. And we'll see the silos of everywhere and the bipolar world coming up. And that is really, we're going nowhere. So, and also,
I think, Henry, thank you. I think we can all agree with that if China and America can't get their relationship working better, then we're all in trouble. Francois, I want you to bring down the curtain on this.
Absolutely.
What is your thought for the revamp?
I actually agree with everything that has been said in this last part of the session by the predecessors. So I'd simply add one Eurocentric recommendation, because the EU has overall been actually the best performer in fighting global warming. We're also, I think, fairly much in the vanguard in terms of regulating artificial intelligence. So the EU has to be able to weather the storm of the crisis of the global order, and for that, the recipe is paradoxically in the area of security. We need to spend 3% of our GDP on defense, not because this is what would please Donald Trump, but actually despite Donald Trump. The US is going to be distracted, Indo-Pacific and so on. Russia is not getting any nicer, particularly if it sees that it's going to win the war in Ukraine, and therefore the Europeans actually have to engage in a serious security and defense project in order to be good, strong players in terms of revamping the global order.
And in the spirit of Francois' opening remark about the EU, I will close with my thought on the revamp of the global order, which is for the European Union to allow Britain to come back into the European Union very easily and smoothly, but I do work for the Financial Times, everyone. I can see Jonathan shaking his head there in disbelief.
You're welcome.
I think we should just thank this terrific panel for their great comments and interventions. Thank you very much.